Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for joining our second session of the Culture of Academic Medicine Initiative Wellbeing Matters webinar series. This session is titled Inclusive by Design, Accommodations and the Medical Training Pathway. I'm really excited to welcome a number of guests for this session. We'll go through a few logistical pieces, and then we'll get right away on with our program. So my name is Victor. I'm co-chair of the Culture of Academic Medicine Initiative. I'm a pediatrician in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, coming to you from Treaty 6 territory. From an acknowledgement standpoint, we would like to begin by acknowledging that the AFMC is hosting this session on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people in Ottawa. And we respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of the land from which each of you are joining us from. Our speakers come from all across Canada, and like I said, myself here in Edmonton in Treaty 6. And beyond just an acknowledgement of the land, I think, particularly with our topic, but in all of those related to the Culture of Academic Medicine Initiative, it's important to reflect and think about our role in Indigenous reconciliation in the health system, but also in advancing our medical education partnership with Indigenous communities as we kind of work towards meeting the goals of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, many of which are noted that healthcare system and medical education can affect. So a couple logistical things. The session is being recorded because people will be able to watch after, including yourselves. All participants, you automatically have your kind of cameras off, you're muted, but you'll be able to interact, and you can do that through the Q&A function. And once we get to the discussion part at the end, you'll be able to raise your hand and speak. And then just a reminder, of course, in all our topic discussion, we really want vigorous discussion and great points of view from everyone, but to please contribute discussions thoughtfully to help support a positive environment for all of our learning here. So available in the chat function, we have for audio interpretation and subtitles, we use this program called Worldly that has kind of an AI interpretation. So you can see in the chat either scanning a QR code, you can select a preferred language, which may be en français, or can be others. And you can do that on a different screen or a different device as well. So these options are available for you from an accessibility and language standpoint. And then this is a accredited session. So of course we have a steering committee. These are some of the members, and we thank all of these individuals, and these are their conflicts. As an activity as a whole, the Culture of Academic Medicine Initiative and this webinar series receives funding from the Canadian Medical Association, MD Financial, and Scotiabank. And so that's just a note. And we greatly appreciate their funding of the initiative, and then that allows this webinar series and other activities to happen as well. So those formalities out of the way, I'm glad to be able to introduce our speakers. So again, I said hi myself, but the star of the show are these four individuals here. I'll introduce them one by one, and then they'll go through their disclosures as well. So we first have Franco Rizzuti. Franco is a public health physician and MOH in Alberta and president of the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities. Franco, if you want to just say hi.
Yeah, good. Well, still good morning from where I am. Thanks, Victor. Good morning, everyone. And you'll see my disclosures on the slide. Nothing further to add. Thanks, Victor. Back to you.
Thanks. Next, we have Quentin Clark, who is a resident in child adolescent psychiatry at UBC and also vice president of the Canadian Association of Physicians with Disabilities. Quentin, can you give us a hi?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Also, morning still where I am, and thank you for having me. As Victor mentioned, there's a few conflicts or to disclose, mostly around some previously done consulting work for Vancouver Coastal Health and the SFU Medical School. I also have received some honorariums from the AFMC and a few other presentations that I've given in the past.
Thank you, Quentin. Next, we have Michael Kwan, who's a general internist at the Ottawa Hospital and also co-chairs the Inclusive Working Group for the Royal College National Wellbeing Plan. Michael, can you say hi to us?
Hi, Victor. Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to see so many people online. So thank you everyone for joining. I have some disclosures that are listed there, and none of them will be affecting the content of my presentation. Thank you.
Great. And then next, Dr. Pamela Liao, who's the inaugural Disability Health Lead and Special Advisor to the Dean at Toronto Metropolitan University School of Medicine. Pamela, can you say hi to us?
Thank you, Victor. It's so nice to see everyone. Afternoon, where I am. You'll see, actually, this is, I think, unfortunately outdated slide. So in terms of conflicts, I'm an employee at Toronto Metropolitan University, but have also received some honoraria from the Ontario Medical Association doing consulting work, advising on a resource they're developing for accommodations for physicians working in the community. None of the affiliations today will impact the content of my presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So with that, we've done our introductions and we get to do the presentation, Q&A, and all the fun parts. So thanks everyone for sticking with us while we do the intros. A lot of that is logistical stuff for accredited sessions, but I'm super excited now to hand things over to our panel to talk about this important topic around accommodations and really designing an inclusive environment in medical education. So our speakers will take some time going through different areas of their expertise, interest, and experience. And then, as we've noted, please, you're welcome to use the Q&A function to put in questions throughout. We'll hold questions kind of till the end part in terms of actually asking and having that discussion. But please feel free to engage throughout. I'll hand it over right away to Quentin for you to start off the session.
Perfect. Thank you, Victor. Um, so today, our learning objectives for this session, we're hoping that by the end of it, and once everyone's been able to complete their portion of the presentation, that you'll be able to have an understanding of the ethical and legal responsibilities around disability accommodations, identify some structural barriers to accessibility in medical training, and apply an inclusive design and proactive accommodation strategies with regards to disability. We're hoping that you'll also be able to identify some current resources that are available to support accessibility action. Next slide, please, Victor. Perfect. So beginning today, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the national picture looks like for accommodations in Canada. Unfortunately, there's relatively little research or published data on this, and much of the data is kind of in-house at each of the respective medical schools. However, a few years ago, my colleague... Oh, I'm just hearing someone speaking. A few years ago, my colleague Julia Haynes and I sought out to actually characterize the rates of disability accommodation on the MCCQE Part 1 exam. For those of you unfamiliar, this is an exam that all medical students write typically at the end of their training. And so we viewed it as a good barometer for what national kind of disability accommodations looked like. And as you can see from the chart on the right, between kind of 2015 and 2021, the percentage of applicants who had test accommodations increased by a little over 200%. And so it does seem to suggest that the rates of accommodations in Canada are increasing. Though I suspect that this data likely underestimates the number of students actually attaining accommodations, as certainly this would only represent those who needed accommodations on an examination, like on a test in a test environment, I should say, rather than those who may need accommodations in the clinical setting during clerkship or other residency experiences. And just before I leave this slide, I'll note that in the bottom left corner there is a QR code, and on the remainder of my slides as well, that will link to the papers that this information is drawn from, if anyone's interested in looking at that. Next slide, please, Victor. In terms of the kind of better or more robust research on accommodations, a lot of that has come out of the US from Lisa Meeks and her colleagues affiliated with the Docs with Disabilities Initiative. And Dr. Meeks and her colleagues initially did some work back in 2019, in which they kind of compared and contrasted with some work they'd done previously in 2016, where they surveyed a large swath of the medical schools across the US and got about a 60% response rate to look at the number of students with disabilities and the number of those who were in turn receiving accommodations. And what they found broadly was that about 93% of students who identified as having a disability did receive accommodations. But even in their study, between the years of 2016 and 2019, they did notice an increase as well of about 2% in terms of students reporting disabilities. What you'll note in the figure there as well in that table that I've included is that the majority of disability accommodations and disabilities endorsed were related to conditions like ADHD, learning disabilities, psychological disabilities, and chronic health disabilities. You'll notice that a minority rather of the disabilities endorsed were those related to mobility or sensory impairments. Next slide, please, Victor. And Lisa Meeks and her team followed this up with a paper that was done by Nguyen et al. Just this year, actually, that looked at accommodations requests and approval on the USMLE Step 1 examination. And what they found, what I'll draw your attention to in this table actually, is the disability type section. They did find overall that approvals varied significantly by disability type, time of diagnosis, whether this was prior to medical school, during medical school, and the type of school resources that were available to students. And they particularly looked into disability resource professionals, and these are trained individuals who have additional training in around medical education to understand what accommodations a student might need and how to go about navigating that process. But what I'll draw your attention to in the table there that I find particularly interesting and definitely comparable to the Canadian context is really the difference around disability type and the type of accommodations that are getting approved. You'll notice for, say, the group that has physical or sensory impairments, or for the groups that have chronic health conditions, that the approval rate for accommodations on this examination is pretty much 100%, high 90s, high 80s, or 100%, versus those with ADHD and those with psychological disabilities, it's closer to 50%. And when you consider this information with that information I presented in the slide previously that suggested that the majority of students with disabilities have kind of ADHD or psychological disabilities, I think it does paint a bit of a troubling picture on the situation for accommodations. Next slide, please. And that's important to consider in relation to Canadian case law and some major cases that have happened in the last kind of 2 decades around disability accommodations. So there was the case of Dr. Dunkley and UBC where she was declined in residency an ASL interpreter because the university viewed it as being too costly. And she ultimately won that fight at the Human Rights Tribunal after many years of legal proceedings, and was reinstated in her residency program with the appropriate accommodations. Similarly, with the case of Dr. Kelly and UBC again about a year later, a similar challenge where the university viewed that the accommodations were too laborious to implement for his learning and psychological disabilities. and that they weren't accommodations that would be accessible to him in real world practice. This case was lost as well, and there was a significant settlement to Dr. Kelly of more than $400,000. So it was quite costly cases for the universities when they did decline to appropriately accommodate their students. The other case I'll mention that's not so much from the medical world, but that's important is actually the case of Denoda versus York University, which wasn't actually 2016 or 2026 rather. That's a typo. It was in 2016, where she fought for against York University for concerns that York would only accommodate her if they had a specific diagnosis provided. And she fought in the Human Rights Tribunal back in Ontario that this was violating her right to privacy. And the tribunal ultimately agreed with her and put out a pretty comprehensive document on the information that a student did have to provide or would have to provide to attain accommodations, which does not include a specific diagnosis. And I think for those of us in kind of roles where we are accommodating students, that's another important piece of information to keep in mind. Next slide, please, Victor. And I'll hand it over to Franco.
Thanks, Quentin, and thanks, Victor. So building off of what Quentin outlined, what you'll see we have as the snapshot on the right is the new AFMC endorsed technical standard. So to remind folks, the medical school technical standards prior to this version really originated in the 80s with, a variety of updates since. But these technical standards very much took a deficit-based approach to abilities for medical trainees and were built in an era of very strong ableism and normativity within medicine. And so long overdue to say, let's actually refresh the technical standards, not just to accommodate the realities in, the mid 2020s, but to really speak to what are some of the aspirational and positivistic elements to embed them into medical schools. And so Dr. Holmes led a terrific consultative group over a number of years that ultimately resulted in the creation of these new technical standards, which have been endorsed, and we know schools are working to implement them. But let's take half a step back because it connects to what Quentin was speaking to. So if we look at data sets, one of the biggest challenges we had in Canada for a long time was we didn't have good data. We didn't have good data of physicians experiencing and living with disabilities in practice. Thanks to the Canadian Medical Association and the National Physician Health Survey done in 2021, we started to have that data. So we know that the Canadian rates of disabilities in the population of Stats Canada align almost perfectly with the rates of physicians living with disabilities and chronic conditions. Some variability, as Quentin alluded to, as to the specific subtypes of disability, but we know physicians do have disabilities. And so we know we needed to make a change. We also knew that we needed to rethink some accommodations. And so these technical standards get us one step closer towards that. We outline in here, there's a few pieces that connect accreditation requirements. They link to principles for admission, and really begin to encourage leadership at the university levels to not just, adopt these technical standards, but think about how do we start operationalizing this within the Canadian medical training ecosystem. The last piece I'll say in this space is that we know accommodations are a step. It's not the end. In a perfect world, we would be in a space of universal design and reduction of barriers within the health system. So not just for medical education, but for the entire health sector. And so we know that until we reach that end goal of really integrating universal design and accessibility, removing that ableism within medicine, we know we're going to need accommodations. And so how do we do that better? We'll switch to the next slide, Victor. And so when we're thinking a little bit about accommodations, again, we look to our colleagues south of the border. And this is a really important piece to stress. So the States, with everything going on, all of that parked, the States is somewhere between a decade to 2 decades ahead of Canada when it comes to accommodations and when it comes to accommodations and disability in the healthcare space. And that is due to one reason and one reason only. The states litigate everything. And so there is significant case law and litigation history in the states, often with millions, if not tens of millions of dollars price tags with lawsuits that have resulted in the states being a decade or two ahead of us. Canada doesn't have that, but as Quentin laid out, we have some very strong case law. And so it's one that if Canada does not start addressing these critical human rights violations and challenges, we could see ourselves in the states of the states. And so we're trying to work collaboratively to get ahead of that. And so again, we look to the states. Just this last year, they've been able to put out this foundational document that outlines core principles and examples for accommodations. This moves away from every school having to do their own made in-house accommodation, but speaks to here's principles, here's examples of what can be done. And so within Canada, we're laying the groundwork in its infancy for this sort of work. And so more to come on this sort of work, but just important to plug that a resource does exist when we're looking as to what type of accommodations could exist, and specifically in the clinical space. We know abilities offices often challenge with what do medical trainees need to do, and so great resource out of the States. And the last piece I'll comment, and a little bit of a plug, and I know Pam will speak more to it. So Pam and I are the inaugural co-chairs of the AFMC's Disability Inclusion Network, kind of placeholder of a name, but opportunity. We're building it out over the next year with really a formal launch at ICAM 2026. As an opportunity to bring together folks who are doing disability related work in the medical education space, building that, collective momentum, building that critical capacity, sharing lessons learned, sharing rub points, and using that as an opportunity to continue to support. So looking forward to next steps, lots of work there. And Victor, with that, we'll go to the next slide. This one here is just a few references, a lot of what Quentin alluded to, and with that, I'll hand it over to Mike.
Thank you, Franco. Yeah, I'm going to just transition a little bit to, beyond medical education, but I'll also highlight some of the work I've been doing in medical education. I know everybody here is working within academic medicine, so I think a lot of this is relevant, for potentially you and your peers, as well as for residents transitioning into practice. So this first graphic is related to the National Plan for Health Workforce Wellbeing in the United States. So I know the U.S. is ahead of us in some regards, but I'll highlight here how we will hopefully be ahead of the U.S. So this was, quite an impressive document, over 100 pages. It was led by the Surgeon General, representation from over 200 U.S. institutions, basically providing a set of recommendations to preserve the health workforce well-being. I published last year in JAMA a commentary called Addressing Ableism in Physician Wellbeing Planning, which I'm proud of, in particular because this plan, as good and extensive as it was, it did not address disability. It did not address accommodations. In fact, accommodations in this national plan were only referenced when you were to accommodate time off or time away for medical appointments, which is an entirely ableist recommendation for all those who need to work with accommodations rather than just take time off or go to appointments. So this was a big gap in their national plan, and I think we are aiming to do better than the U.S. By bringing concepts of accessibility, inclusivity, and structural change into our national well-being plan. Next slide, please. I don't have an emblem from the Canadian National Wellbeing Plan. I don't think there is one yet, but as some of you may know, the Royal College was funded by Health Canada to lead our own version of this National Wellbeing Plan with input from a lot of the national organizations as well as the CFPC. And it's an ongoing project. I'm one of the co-chairs of one of the working groups, but I can proudly report that so our working group is called Recruit and Retain an Inclusive Workforce Working Group, workforce. It's going really well. There's a representation from lots of different healthcare professionals, not just physicians. But I can assure you, this concept of accessibility and accommodations is forefront, if not the most prominent theme that we talk about. So I think there's no doubt that our official national well-being strategy and plan will include more accessibility and accommodation recommendations. Next slide. So other areas I've been working on are to try to drive change through policy, standards, and leadership. And at the medical education level, we have an ongoing project evaluating PGME accommodation policies in Canada, which I guess I can't really share yet because we're trying to get it published, but it will follow. It's sort of a national evaluation of where we stand at the PGME level, and there are definitely room for improvement there. Same for leadership roles. We are wondering, especially after I learned about Pam's new role at TMU, are there other leadership roles in faculties of medicine across Canada, specifically with a mandate to improve disability inclusion? And you can all look within your institutions. That also is coming in terms of publication, hopefully. I think there's, again, big room for opportunity there to advance leadership. And then finally is accreditation standards. So I'm part of the, one of the Royal College Committee on Accreditation. And you may or may not know this, but there are no accreditation standards for accommodations at the PGME level, despite the fact that there's rapidly rising requests for accommodations, and despite the fact of the legal obligations, there still are no standards. So if you have any potential opportunities to leverage change in that regard, I'd welcome it. I'm hoping that we can build that into next accreditation standards coming. And then finally, there's a lot of challenges still, but there is a lot of progress as well. So just to highlight a couple of areas of progress. One, I was part of the first accessibility and accommodations policy at any hospital in Canada. For physicians, not for employees, but for physicians with disabilities. And this was implemented at our hospital a couple of years ago, and we have since had implementation of a Department of Emergency Medicine policy that followed the Department of Medicine policy. So there's opportunity for policy implementation there at all of your academic institutions. I'd welcome you to reach out. There's room for policy implementation everywhere, essentially. Next slide. And through the policy, we've advocated with our Provincial Medical Association, the Ontario Medical Association, who took a keen interest in what are the legal obligation at a staff physician level, not just as a resident, but as a staff. There's a bit of uncertainty across the culture of medicine in terms of what are the legal protections as physicians with disabilities. Now, interestingly, in Ontario, they reviewed legislation and they confirmed that, in fact, physicians who work as independent contractors in Ontario hospitals are protected by the same duty to accommodate that employees are in the hospital setting. Now, this is provincial and doesn't necessarily apply equally across provinces. However, it's a huge step forward. OMA has a great online resource that outlines this and raises awareness. And again, for anyone involved in medical association roles, I would be hopeful that we see some medical associations following Ontario's lead on this end. Next slide. Final comments are these. This is under the umbrella of the CAPD. We have developed it's a community of practice virtually to connect people. It's gone through a few challenges in terms of like where this lives online. However, it's landed finally on just a private LinkedIn page. The QR code is there. I encourage anyone who in the audience who has a disability or chronic health condition to consider joining or sharing to your networks. And we've intentionally kept this broad in terms of disability as well as chronic health conditions to be inclusive of all physicians and learners, whether or not they self-identify as having a disability or not. They're welcome in the community, and please join and share. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you, everyone. I just wanted to start by recognizing we're gathered here today on International Day of Persons with Disabilities, and it's a really coming at full circle moment. When I first had experience with disability in residency, there was no one to talk to, and it was seen as something really shameful. And the fact we have so much leadership happening in our country across all provinces, and I see so many familiar names in who are logged in here as well across the country. I think we're really making huge strides, and to have a community to come together like this is really meaningful. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. So as mentioned earlier, my name is Pamela Liao, and I'm currently the Disability Health Lead and Special Advisor to the Dean at Toronto Metropolitan University, which is the newest kid on the block. So for those of you who haven't sort of seen the latest, we launched very proudly this fall, both with our undergraduate medical learners, of whom there are 94, as well, and this is not as well recognized, is that we also launched 16 postgraduate medical programs as well. And so I'll just highlight here that one of the first accomplishments was that we offered accommodations to applicants, which was the first time we did that at the university. So in this image is actually our front lobby of the school, and I mention it because I think it's really special. Our design firm worked with the Two Row architectural firm to incorporate Indigenous elements into the building design. And so you'll see the arch columns are meant to represent the trees. And if you see the lights at the very top, they're in sort of erratic or random pattern, and that's to represent the stars in the sky. So anyone welcome to come visit in Brampton. Next slide, please. So this is just my disclosure slide and a little bit of who I am. We've already gone through that, so you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So in terms of welcoming our learners, and we've kind of touched on, the systemic ways in which we can break down barriers to ensure that those with disabilities are welcomed at the start, rather than this narrative we sort of previously had of welcoming physicians into practice and at some point in their journey acquiring a disability is one way, but how can we make sure that schools have their doors welcome? And so one thing I wanted to share about our undergraduate admissions process is we actually have a number of pathways. Some of the leads of these pathways are logged in today. And so we have the general admissions stream, but we also have an Indigenous admissions pathway, a Black admissions pathway, and an equity deserving admissions pathway that characterizes a number of priority equity deserving groups, one of which is disability. Next slide, please. In order to ensure that our accommodations were readily available to anyone across any pathway applying to our school, we pull together a subcommittee. And I'd like to highlight some of the key principles that informed this subcommittee, which have been also applied across the board at our school in terms of accommodations, even for enrolled learners. The first being confidentiality, and that is someone who's sharing their health information should not also be part of any type of evaluation. And so the image I have here is of two train tracks in parallel. They don't cross, and that's sort of to reflect this principle. The next piece is around self-awareness, and this came up in one of the talks we've had this week. Any of our file reviewers are required to participate in anti-bias training as well as to sign conduct agreements. So recognizing the importance of maintaining confidentiality, but also to identify ableism in how they review files, because while we do our best to keep accommodations private, it may be part of, for example, the interview process where someone noticeably has more time, and to recognize that accommodations are not to give an advantage, but rather to eliminate barriers. We have disability representation at all levels of decision making and review. We wanted to make sure that accommodations were both available and we proactively advertised these. And we involved in expert consultations whenever we needed throughout the pathway, whether that be with legal groups, with disability or occupational health. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of how we went from a startup through to the bridge and to steady state at the school in terms of a strategy on disability inclusion. Next slide, please. In terms of the startup, you're building a medical school from scratch. And while in some ways that's really exciting and different from being in a leadership role on disability at an established school, it also has a number of challenges, but also really exciting opportunities. So the first step was to really identify who are the key players, what are the kind of priorities that we have, and to ensure engagement both within the school, but also across the university and other partner organizations. So for example, as mentioned before, advocacy with the AFMC led to the development of the Disability Inclusion Network, of whom I see many of our members here today. So welcome. The next step was to develop an accommodations working group, which we did across many portfolios within the school. And one of the first tasks was to update our policy. So the university had an accommodations policy, Senate Policy 159, and we had a working group that then updated these to reflect the unique features of our medical school. Notably, our postgraduate program has an exemption from the University Senate, so they sort of self-regulate. And we then developed a separate accommodations policy for our postgraduate learners, which I recognize is a very unique situation because they have the dual identity of both being a learner and an employee. And so, as you've seen in some of the case law described previously, it's really important we have a robust policy here to outline who is responsible ultimately for both developing the accommodations plan as well as implementation. And finally, I've already spoke on this, but how do we make sure that our admissions processes are inclusive and accessible? Next slide, please. So from those sort of key initial pieces we needed to have in place for launch, there's a number of other components to help getting us to steady state. And so we went from a working group to developing an academic accommodations committee that would be available to review complex files, to review any areas that required extra resources, and also a resource for faculty who may want to proactively look at ways to incorporate accessibility or universal design principles into their teaching. I will highlight that we advocated and were successful in recruiting a dedicated accommodations facilitator for the School of Medicine, which is a best practice recommendation out of the, again, US guidelines. And I hope one day we'll have our very own in Canada. And so this has been a really exciting achievement for us because I think it's been mentioned before, but the general university accommodations offices don't necessarily speak the language of medicine and vice versa. And so having someone to translate is a real resource both for learners, but also for our faculty members. The other piece that I'll speak to is actually on the next slide. So I'll pass through this, but one other feature I'll highlight is just going back to Michael's comments around faculty. And so we often talk about accommodations from the perspective of welcoming our learners, but equally, we need faculty members to be recruited in a way that's inclusive, that shows that we value the wisdom that they have to offer us. And this Monday, our university hosted our faculty rounds where we launched our faculty accommodations guide, showing that whether your site is teaching at the university or at one of our clinical affiliates, that you have a first place to go in terms of seeking support around accommodations. Next slide, please. So in terms of steady state, I spoke to the Academic Accommodations Committee and the key components of it. I think the one real question that comes to this table is what are the essential learning requirements? And thankfully now we can look on the rear view of the work that Franco described by leaders across our country in terms of technical standards that have had the ableist components of them removed as a real resource to drive and guide this work. The other role of this committee I haven't mentioned yet, but of course, is to review any policies or procedures so that we ensure that everything is being monitored on an ongoing basis so we can continue with each cycle of learners that come through to improve how we deliver accommodations. Next slide, please. Finally, what I'd like to highlight is the other committee that we're developing, and this is brought up by someone, I forget who, I apologize, but that accommodations are really eliminating barriers in a system and structures that have ableism built into them. But really, the ultimate goal is to incorporate universal design principles. And so, to that end, we have a committee focused on just this. The idea would be that we look at both physical and digital spaces, as well as curriculum from an anti ableist and disability justice perspective. And that committee incorporates partners like our librarian, our head librarian, as well as our building manager, because those are the key players to really implement things and to try and be proactive in how we address accessibility. We've talked about a lot of resources today, and something that I'm really proud to share is the Bikram S. Dillon Library at our school has an accessibility and disability inclusion in medicine library guide. So this is freely available to everyone on the call. I'll highlight that we have resources both for faculty members who are living with a disability as well as learners, but also includes resources on how to teach learners with disabilities and serve patients with disabilities. So we're really looking at all the different lenses, and those are sort of that's sort of the perspective and how we broke down the categories within this library. Much of the current research that we've described, as well as I think it's been mentioned already, but there's a special issue on academic medicine focused on disability inclusion, is all linked here. To be honest, I probably add a resource or two pretty much every week since we've launched this. And so I welcome all of you to take advantage of the QR code. It's also in my email signature. If anyone reaches out to me, you can check it out there. And our library team is just incredible. They're always looking at ways to make sure that teaching resources and learning resources can be available in multiple formats. And we do have some experts on making those offerings available in different ways. So speech to text friendly, all those sort of things. So for those of you who have been jotting down notes, I would say most of the resources that have been mentioned during the talk are here, and happy to make this available to everyone. Again, I think this is just one more example of where we can collaborate nationally, going back to Franco's point on the partnership that we have with the AFMC and the Disability Inclusion Network. Thank you so much. And this is just a shout out to our team. We no longer fit in this stairwell and area, but I think just to recognize that in order to do this work at this level takes commitment across the school. And so I just wanted to acknowledge them here. Thank you.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much to Pamela, Franco, Michael, and Quentin for sharing different aspects of your work and things that are happening across Canada and in this space. And thanks in the chat for the ongoing sharing of resources. Those who signed up also should receive after when we ask you to fill out your evaluations, which you should definitely do, resources as well that have been compiled by the team here. So I'd like to move us to our Q&A portion. We have a good 15 minutes or so to do that because we could speak and present and talk about the work and challenges and intersectional ways to think about this space for hours and hours, but we hope to engage all of you in part of that conversation. So I know the chat is open, and that's probably a more convenient place for some folks to write things in. If you can navigate to the Q&A to place your questions, that's great. But ultimately, use what's easiest for you to get your points across. And again, happy if anyone wants to do a raised hand to speak as well. But I'll get rid of the slides for now, and just have us as the folks, Quentin, Franco, Michael, and Pamela here for you to ask any questions. Obviously, this isn't the end of the conversation, as they've all noted. Lots of ongoing, really good work happening. And I learned a lot from listening to them about the work that's happening in the area. And I'm someone who's semi-engaged in all the well-being work and learning environment work. So I'm sure everyone really appreciate that. So of course, thank you, Quentin, Franco, Michael, Pamela, for that. So yeah, you don't want to hear me talk and ask questions this whole time. So let's see what the audience has. Okay, to warm everyone up, maybe I'll just start, and anyone can take this. But I guess as all of you who've been individuals working in this space, what's maybe your one big, like as we head into 2026, what's your big hope or kind of wish list item? You mentioned a few that hopefully will get better than US ad as a whole, but anyone want to say, what's that low-hanging fruit that actually we can really advance a lot on if we all collectively on this call, for example, go back and go to our institutions and try to make them change. So anyone want to tackle that? Quentin's smiling. He's going to tackle that.
I have I guess, two low-hanging fruit things. I'd really like to see a serious conversation happen about incorporating accommodations that students have in their undergraduate programs, not their medical programs, but the programs that they're coming from, being brought into UGME, like transitioned over without having to be reevaluated. I think from the medical school perspective, it's a time-saving effort of not having to relitigate this. But I think from the student perspective, it's a period of transition. Transition periods in medicine are hard, and it would make it just a little bit easier. I think the other thing is the technical standards document that Franco talked about that's been endorsed rather by the AFMC broadly. I'd like to see that taken up by each of the respective medical schools across Canada, and not this reliance on the older technical standards that were developed in the 70s.
Thanks, Quentin. Yeah, as someone who's done some student advisor work, I put it in a thing to me to talk to people about how if you've had accommodations before, that we don't try to put on superhero capes and not do it here. But if we have lots of barriers, like you're saying, not a surprise if that maybe it doesn't happen. Michael, go ahead.
Thanks. There is a question there, but Victor, yeah, I mean, in terms of low-hanging fruit, I think I think all universities, at the very least, should be sharing resources for their learners so that they can find community. And this experience of disability in medicine can be quite isolating, and this is critical. In fact, that med schools and PGME offices know the communities that exist across Canada, including the CAPD, this growing LinkedIn community within it, so that they can find other people across Canada who are already experienced in this work and able to offer support and mentorship. So that would be easy low-hanging fruit for all schools.
Thanks, Michael. I know when I had my time as lead resident when I was in residency and we were trying to deal with this, it felt like, yeah, you're just doing it by yourself without who to go to. And now all these resources and things are incredible. There's a question in the chat from Janet, kind of asking, there's been conversations about this happening for decades. I wonder what the panelists feel about, do you agree that there's a momentum to jump into the narrative of anti-ableism now, and whether that's kind of evoking action? Franco, do you want to have some thoughts on that? I
Sure.
think there's also been discussion kind of around, as more people know this is a thing, lots of different perspectives on that spectrum of, is more action happening? Is some of the blowback in the US maybe, spreading to other places? What do you think?
Yeah, no, thanks, Victor. And maybe I'll speak to Janet's question and the broader one that you raised as well together. So I think, I think there is momentum. I think we're at a turning point and a bit of a critical mass. I didn't speak to numbers before, but I'll speak to it now, right? Depending the data you see, we're somewhere between a fifth and a quarter of physician trainees identifying as living with a chronic condition or disability. That's not a small number. We're not talking fringe. We're talking a quarter of the workforce. And so I think we're at a spot now where if we want to talk about integrated health human resource plans, if we want to talk about culture of medicine, if we want to talk about overall wellness, we need to talk about disability. And so I think we're getting to a point where, there is momentum. We're at an ability to start talking about ableism as an ism within medicine and starting to dismantle that. There's still a lot of work to do. And so, if there was a goal for 2026, and it's a big goal, is I would love to see every faculty of medicine actually integrate anti-ableism, and a principle of accommodation, and then that broader universal design as a foundational principle. It's going to take time to operationalize, but if we can at least get endorsement that we need to be doing this work, it's no longer a nice to have, it's a must have. I think, 2026 is going to be off to a great start.
Thanks, Franco. Pamela, I'll hand it over to you, and I have a question in the Q&A, which I'll direct to you right after too.
Sure, thank you. There's so many good questions and nice to see so many familiar faces in the chat as well. So I don't know if this is low-hanging fruit, but I think there is an incredible opportunity to engage our partners at the regulatory level when it comes to this work. I think a huge amount of stigma and fear comes from this sense that we are very different from the traditional employee because we are obligated to report health issues as it pertains to our ability to practice. And so I think that's really an area of opportunity. I will say I had the opportunity to present some of the work we're doing at TMU around our admissions, and it was really well received, and I think just signaled a level of acceptance and normalization. So often in my role, I'll get asked, again, quietly, not in big meetings where there's a huge audience, but to say either from potential applicants or even from our faculty, but so and so has such and such diagnosis. Can they still apply? That's probably my number one most asked question. And so I think if we can start to change the narrative, and I think this data from the CMA is so valuable because it does, for the first time, start to change this idea of us and them. And for so long, and in so many ways, we're looking to build the profession to reflect the community it serves, and it needs to in so many ways, but in particular with disability. So I think there's a real opportunity there to progress. And so at this meeting, there was a lot of interest from some of the registrars at the colleges because they see this coming, and I think that they're maybe now in a different position to start having conversations that maybe weren't happening before. And so I think that would really shift the dynamic. I'm sorry, I don't know what other questions have come up, but happy to
Yeah,
stop. I don't know,
no.
you can ask me another one or I'm happy to
Yeah,
stop there.
I was just, thanks, Pamela. Yeah, I was gonna, so there's a question in the Q&A that I'll ask you. So it's in a post-COVID learning environment, online or hybrid options are more common for learners. Any thoughts on how you would consider balancing the essential requirements of medical school, like in the UGME environment, with flexibility that distance learning offers as a potential accommodation? And I've put it into the chat for people in case some people aren't seeing the Q&A section. Yeah.
So COVID has changed so much. Let's even take medical education aside for our patients. Getting to appointments, the entire navigating the world with a disability, especially if it has functional impacts on mobility, being able to access healthcare providers in different formats that are patient-centered has really changed the game. And unfortunately, much of that progress has been clawed back, and it would be great to see those things change. But equally, our learners trained in those environments. So while when I was in family medicine, we were in clinic the entire time. Trainees during COVID were seeing patients virtually. We were learning to supervise residents virtually. All kinds of things we sort of thought maybe later, maybe never, had to happen overnight. And so, with sort of that very difficult time, there was a rapid incorporation of technology and innovation that we saw. And so, absolutely, I think in so many ways it's changed how we deliver healthcare, and so equally making education also accessible in so many different ways. Thanks for the question.
Pamela, there's a comment, but I think good to go on, and maybe Quentin, in your section, you talked about legislation. Janet writes, being concerned with perpetuating the misnomer imposed by legislation about what disability is and is not, and the idea of attaching disability to a person's body or mind, or kind of putting the onus on them versus structural pieces. Franco, you also alluded to this in your piece. So I guess Quentin, Franco, as we kind of get to our time, maybe some more thoughts and reflection about that of, again, that idea of the ownership or onus being on individuals versus system, and how to practically help us think about that.
Yeah, and I think Janet brings up a good point there in terms of and I think it's a bigger challenge too of kind of retraining physicians and medical educators to understand disability from a different way than their training allows them to understand disability, for like away from the medical model to a more social model. But I think Janet's point is well taken in that I think a lot of that misnomer is what's got us to the point that we're in right now, where accommodations are kind of challenged, but also needed without often, and I'm glad to hear that Pamela's doing some work on this at TMU, but without the consideration of the removing of the barriers that are actually preventing full participation for students or faculty with disability. Yeah, I don't know that I have too much more to say than that, but I think it's a good point that she raises.
And Victor, maybe I'll just add briefly. I think the one piece I'll say, so I completely agree with what Quentin said, and thanks, Janet, for raising it. I think, you know, overall, in terms of what can we do, I think it's approaching disability, ableism with a sense of curiosity. I think there's a lot of fear of even, leadership looking at what is mobility, what is accessibility like at my school, because they're afraid of what it's going to show. And I think if we all engage in it in a sense of curiosity and learning more, it puts us in a good spot to then start working. And we're not going to boil the ocean overnight. There's a lot of work to do, but I think if we're approaching it with a sense of curiosity, recognizing some of these system pieces, but step by step, starting to undo some of the harms, I think we'll be in a good spot. So completely agree with Quentin, and again, thanks, Janet, for raising it.
Fantastic. And that brings us to a close. So I think a great way to end, which is to always be curious about how we can change systems and think about these paradigms differently. So I want to give a special thank you, of course, to Quentin, Franco, Michael, and Pamela for joining us for this session. The evals in the chat, you'll also get this post to please complete that so that we can continue to improve these sessions. Lots of congratulations from all the people who attended. So thanks so much to everyone. And then our webinar series continues next in February. So we have a break for the holiday season, but you'll get promotions and things from us shortly around that and in the coming months. So thanks everyone for joining. Thanks to our speakers again, and have a great rest of the day.